In this video segment of the Wall Street Academy, I'm going to be covering something that I personally love to use. It's called Pivot Points Standard. Pivot points are widely used by day traders to quickly determine where Forex market sentiment may change between bullish and bearish. I personally like to use them to plot and find support and resistance levels. So moving forward, how to add this as an indicator, you're going to simply go to indicators. You're going to scroll all the way down until you see this right here where it says Pivot Points Standard. You're going to add it to your chart, and you'll notice that Pivot Points has now been added to your chart. You'll see up here it says 15. What that means is that for every week that passes, a new pivot is going to be created. You'll see right here for, this was the previous week. This is a new week right here. This is the previous or last week. The pivot was right at about 1,093. And for this week, the pivot sits right around 1,089. So a little bit less. Now, I don't need to see 15 weeks worth of pivots, so I like to change the 15 to 5. I also like my lines to be a little bit more visible, so I make them larger by doing this. You'll notice the lines enlarge. And then I like to change the color from orange to black, but it's all preference. You can make them whatever color you'd like. And now you'll see that you now have pivot points on your chart, as well as plotted horizontal support and resistance levels. So moving forward into how to add this to your analysis, just remember this pivot point right here and the pivot points that are going to be created after it is simply where price may change from bearish to bullish and vice versa. So I'll give you an example. Approximately 2 weeks ago, at the beginning of January, we noticed that price had gained some bullish momentum, had actually, you see the pivot point here, it had closed above the pivot point right here, it had approached the first level of resistance, it actually closed above the first level of resistance, and then you'll notice that that week it had actually broke through 4 levels of support. It approached the 5th level and then reversed before creating a new week's pivot. So remember, pivot points are simply used to determine where market sentiment may change between bullish and bearish. What do we notice here? We notice that price had pivoted. It had closed. It actually came all the way up here to the 5th level of resistance, reversed, a new week's pivot had been created, and then price approached this pivot point and actually closed below the pivot point before reversing, touching that pivot point, reversing. It looks like it wicked off of the first level of support and then came all the way back up here to the pivot point, reversed, and now it's sitting on the new week's pivot. Now, one thing to note is that where you see S1 and R1, those right there, that's the strongest level of support and resistance. That's where you're extremely likely to see a reversal. And to give you an example, one actually happened last week off of support level 1 on a 1-hour chart. Alright. So you'll notice right here, price was riding along this pivot point. It had gained some bearish momentum, came all the way down here to the first level of support, around 1073, perfectly touched that line, that level of support, and it had started gaining some bullish momentum. actually came all the way up here to the pivot point again. That was at 1093. So for about 200 pips before reversing and now sitting on the new week's pivot. So let's get back here to a 4-hour chart. And one thing I like to do is I like to couple this with some of my other tools that I use for analysis. One of my favorite is trend lines, and I'll give you a very good example. I found a trend line on a 4-hour chart on gold right here. Now, if you plot your trend lines a different way, don't worry about it. I'm not saying you're doing it right or wrong. This is simply my preference and how I like to plot trend lines. Some people take it from the very top of the wick all the way down. I personally don't use the wick. But I seen a perfect trend line right here where price had actually touched it 3 times, reversing every single time. Perfect. So now I'm using 2 indicators. I'm using trend lines and I'm using pivot points. So what do I notice here? Price had approached the 5th level of resistance. It had reversed off this trend line, came right back up, reversed all the way down. It had some price action, then came all the way back up here, which also just so happened to be the pivot point, and then reversed back down. So remember from previous videos that the more times price touches a trend line, the stronger it becomes. So one thing I like to do is I like to highlight the areas where price had actually touched the trend line. Perfect. So now moving into a new week where a new pivot has been created, new resistance and support levels have been created. Some of my other indications that I'm not using in this chart right now show that price may continue with bearish momentum. So what I would like to see is price either come down here to the first level of support, which sits right around 1070, or come up here, touch this trend line, and then reverse and come down here and approach this first level of support. Now you can use and couple pivot points with, your personal favorite indicators to use. All it's meant to be is simply another indicator to use to add confirmation to your analysis. For instance, if you're looking right now at a buy on gold and it's touching the first level of resistance using pivot points, you may want to let price play out a little bit. Because what would happen if you went, maybe a couple indicators you're using show that, okay, gold right now is a good buy. You put in a buy, but on pivot points, price sits at resistance level 1. You put in a buy thinking it's going to go up. However, price reverses. You lose money below an account, such and such. So this is simply another indicator I like to use to help add just more confirmation to my analysis on particular trades and pairs and things like that. And more confirmation never hurt. But this is one of my most favorite indicators because it's very, very simple to use. As I come to the end of this video, just remember one thing to note. The first level of support and resistance, you'll notice right here and right here, are the strongest. That's where you're likely to see reversals. Also remember that as price breaks through the first level of support and resistance, the next levels become weaker and weaker and weaker. such as resistance level 2, resistance level 3, support level 2, support level 3, and so on. The third thing to remember and final thing is that you can add pivot points and you can couple it with some of your other favorite indicators. You'll notice here that I gave you an example of using a trend line. So that's how I use pivot points. I hope this video helps you. It's very simple to use. But other than that, just keep those few rules in mind. And I wish you all nothing but major success with it. Thank you.